Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming today. Really appreciate it. This is a topic that's really important to me. I don't think it gets spoken about enough in our industry, so that's why I'm here to do it. So a quick intro. I know CJ did a fantastic job, but I may as well fill in some additional details. My name is Joe Parker. My pronouns are he and him. I have a Bachelor of Science in a BS in Computer Science from Lehigh University, founded an MSP and a SaaS business like CJ talked about, became a security consultant a little bit later, and eventually became an InfoSec analyst at Duo Security, now Cisco. You can find me on Twitter at @JoeSParker, and as CJ said, love dogs, music, bikes, barbecue, and Austin in general. So let's talk about this SecOps thing. I can't have a talk about SecOps and not define what that is for folks so that we're all on the same page. A lot of people might think it's this pew-pew map and that we're thwarting those lasers as they're flying at us, but that's not really what it is to me. A way I like to think of us as we are roadies of the internet. We're not the rock stars. We're here to make sure that the show goes on, that the business is functional, that investors are made whole. That is our purpose. This breaks down into 3 sectors we'll talk a little bit about later: incident response, security awareness, as well as vulnerability management. So I want to start off my talk today with a personal story. I think it's really, really important to display vulnerability and show people what vulnerability means. So I'm going to start out with this really, really fantastic quote from Eleanor Roosevelt. It's something that I've come back to many, many times in my life, and it's been really, really helpful to get me through hard times. And that's, you must do the thing you think you cannot do. The thing that you are struggling with, the thing that you think is impossible, that's your mind telling you to do it. I use this example. This is Kachina Peak in Taos, if anyone's familiar with it. It's a fairly technical ski run. I was terrified of it as a child, but eventually got to the point where I could do it. And it's because I focused on turn by turn and not, oh my God, I'm going to fall down this mountain. It's a pretty good analogy for my career in InfoSec, if I'm totally honest. So I started in computers when I was 3. My dad brought home an Apple IIc. I played sneakers on it until I wore out the floppies, and then made him buy it again and again and again. When I was about 14, I really, really figured out I wanted to be an InfoSec. I started seeing videos about DEF CON. I started seeing videos about hacking, and I was like, ooh, how do I do that? How do I do that and not get arrested? So as time evolved, I started meeting people on Twitter. I started engaging with folks. But I was really, really terrified to be seen as not knowledgeable or stupid. That was my biggest fear, is that the people I respected in this industry would see me as something that was other. I was truly afraid to go to meetups. I was afraid to come to cons like this. I was just afraid to be seen for who I was, and I felt like I was an imposter. I mean, straight up. I was afraid to be vulnerable, and I wasn't particularly empathetic at that time. I remember when lulsec was running around and smashing things on the internet, and I got a lot of lulz out of it. I thought it was pretty hilarious at the time, but that it really didn't take into account the people's lives that were affected, the hard work that went into trying to build those systems, and seeing them smashed for fun is really, really terrible when that's something that you have built. Ultimately, this behavior and some other things in my life contributed to me being super, super isolated. This all culminated in severe depression and imposter syndrome. So, imposter syndrome, I think, is a really challenging thing. I think it's something that people continue to struggle with. I know all of us want to hear that, oh, you'll hit this magical gate, and once you get to that gate, you'll never have this problem again. You'll always feel confident. Unfortunately, that's not my case. But I started to try and think about imposter syndrome in a different way. I truly believe if you break down imposter syndrome, what it really is signaling is passion and concern. You're so passionate and concerned about a thing that failure is antithetical to your existence. It is literally the worst thing you could think of. So you become terrified, you think you are incapable of delivering, and you just become really, really scared. But if you can think about those things for what they are, you can start to understand that these are things you can take to your advantage. You can use that passion, you can use that concern to drive what you really, really want out of this. So some of the solutions that I found to getting over imposter syndrome was mentors. It started out really simple, just asking my boss, am I doing a good job at this? Am I miserable, or do I have some things right, some things wrong? Getting some feedback. It was feedback that I was terrified to get in the past. I spoke to peers. Part of my problem is, I found all these great resources on the internet, but I never made those personal connections with anyone. So I didn't really have peers. I was just this random, anime face on Twitter that maybe you want to interact with, or maybe I'm a bot or a troll, who knows. And so I really found some peers that could help me level set, understand, am I doing the right things? Am I doing the wrong things? Am I making good decisions? Am I investing my time in this class or this training? Is that worthwhile? And then it also came to taking care of myself. I wasn't doing a particularly good job. I was working, sometimes 18 hours a day, and it was really kind of falling apart in terms of health. So I took some time to learn meditation. I do yoga. I do a ton of cycling that you see here. And I found that really helped me focus. It let me take a lot of that stress and put it into those physical activities so that when I was working on things, I could focus on those. So about this time, there was a really great event, not for this company, but for me personally. There was a company I was working for, and a boss came to me and said, hey, I think one of our clients got hacked. And I was like, uh-oh. So this is actually a screenshot that I took from SecureList. This is basically some Mamba ransomware, but this is basically what they saw when they came in the morning. all of their machines were locked down. They had been locked from the master boot record, so nothing was booting anymore, including the domain controller, backup servers. 100% of the business was locked up. My boss did not know how to deal with the situation, didn't know how to recover from it. So I jumped in. I didn't really know 100% what I was doing, but I was really passionate about it and I was willing to try. And there were some really, really amazing lessons that I learned. I learned you need to teach people, not shame them. I learned you cannot expect people to be technical experts, you must train them. You must understand that we all make mistakes. The only mistake that we shouldn't make is the mistake we don't learn from, that we don't get feedback from. And finally, communication has to be clear and respectful if you want people to engage. If I came in and acted like an expert and a jerk, who's going to listen to me? Who's going to want to take my expertise if I have it? So all of this boils down to me trying to come up with a thesis or a central point for my talk. And I was trying, it intrinsically made sense to me that empathy and vulnerability were really important, but I was like, how does this tie back to SecOps in a significant way? And it occurred to me it's trust. Trust is critical to our lives in technology and security. Trust requires many things from many people, but it's also different from person to person. And SecOps is literally all about establishing, evaluating, and understanding trust. And who doesn't like little kitties like hugging each other? That sounds fantastic. So I was actually attending a talk about 2 weeks ago for my coworker Taylor, and he actually introduced me to Frances Fry, who's this really, really amazing professor at the Business Harvard School. And she has this theory of trust, that trust is this three-legged stool that is built on authenticity, logic, and empathy. And when I saw this slide in Taylor's presentation, I almost fell out of my chair because I'm like, this is it! This is the thing I needed. So really, really thank you, Taylor. But the point here is that we cannot have trust unless we have equal parts authenticity, logic, and empathy. If one is longer than the other, if one is made of more dense material than the other, you're going to end up having a wobbly stool and not having fantastic trust. And everything that SecOps does is built on this stool. So if we have a wobbly stool, we aren't going to be able to do much. So what is empathy? I thought this was a really, really good way to illustrate at least half of what empathy is to me. Empathy is trying to see things from other people's perspectives. I think that's half of it. But I do think the other half of it is truly evaluating how they got there, what motivates them, what challenges them, what makes them happy in their lives. I also think empathy is this amazing tool for compassion, to relate to each other, and to understand each other at a level that, quite frankly, we couldn't do without it. So at Duo, we have this concept of kinder than necessary. And it's one of those beautiful ideas that's strikingly simple, but incredibly powerful. It's this guiding principle to becoming more empathetic. If you're wondering, how do I start on this path to empathy? How do I act more empathetic? Just start with thinking kinder than necessary. Start with, okay, I have this interaction with you. How can I make this a little better for you? How can I make you feel more engaged? How can I make sure that your concerns are actually listened to? How can I be a better active listener for you? The other thing is, we can assume good intent from others. I've seen a ton of issues in work and other parts of my life where we just assume bad intent from each other. We assume that we were out to get each other, or you're going to do this thing that wastes my time or screws up my day, and you don't really care because it doesn't impact you. And the problem is we're not right every time we make that assumption. In fact, I would posit that we're probably wrong more often than we're right when we do that. So start with your teammates, those that you've established some trust with. Assume they have good intentions. Build yourself some proof before you are going to assume anything otherwise. And it's also really easy to leave someone with a good opinion. When I do an instant response, I might have to come in and ask you a lot of tough questions, but I'm going to try and do it as kind as possible. I want you to leave with the feeling, God, he asked me a ton of tough questions I wasn't really ready for, but he was really kind about it, he was respectful, he understood where I was coming from. There are also some really, really amazing benefits to empathy that aren't always obvious. Monoculture is something that comes from having a lack of empathy. Everyone thinking the same way, everyone reinforcing everyone's ideas. And if you want to have a diversity of thought and diversity of experience, I would really, really encourage you to look into empathy. If you don't have an empathetic team, how are you going to engage people that don't fit into that mold? How are you going to engage people that don't look or act or come from the same place that everyone else came from? The other thing that's really, really important about kinder than necessary is setting reasonable boundaries in a respectful way. Unfortunately, empathy is not something that we have an unlimited supply of, and so we need to guard our empathy and make sure that it's not something that we just discount and give out to every person. And that is part of being kinder than necessary. I have to leave something for me, or else I'm not going to have anything to be empathetic for you. I have to have something in that well to draw from, or I'm not going to be able to facilitate for you. So now let's dive a little bit into emotional vulnerability. I don't know if anyone here is familiar with Arrested Development. This character's name is Job, and he is the antithesis of emotional vulnerability. He has walls upon walls upon walls built around him. He will never admit to a mistake. He will never admit to the reality of the situation in which he lives in. So I think this is a really good way to kind of show the opposite, the inverse of emotional vulnerability. And it also shows how much effort that one has to put into not being vulnerable. You have to build these walls around you to feel safe, and that saps your emotional energy as well as your mental energy that you'd be putting into problem solving or getting better security outcomes for your teams. So this is our friend IR Dog. He's one of the many mascots that we have on the SecOps team, and he encourages us all to be vulnerable in a good way. Not in the sense of this protocol or this or a piece of hardware or this piece of software is vulnerable, but emotionally vulnerable. It really, really helps if you have a drive to improve yourself. It allows you to accept feedback in a way that simply wouldn't be possible. I know when people would give me feedback before I was vulnerable, I wouldn't take it. I'd be like, that's cute, I know you're just trying to say nice things to me, but that's not going to be impactful for me. I've got this figured out. I can see 10 miles ahead. This isn't going to happen. Well, it wasn't true. I needed that feedback. I needed to listen to others. I needed to see where I had room to improve. It also really allows you to honestly measure your own performance. If you have all these walls built up, if you have all these illusions about yourself, if you cast this world through this prism that's really not reality, how will you ever know if you're doing well? How will you ever know if you're performing the results that you need for your team? Putting your ego aside. This is something that was hard for me. This is something that I struggled with. I did not want to put my delicate ego aside. I didn't want it to be bruised. And I learned that was holding me back. My ego was this big object that I had to lean around and say hey, there's important stuff over there. I'm not seeing it though. And so it's really critical to think about that ego and how you can put it maybe in the passenger seat. It doesn't need to be driving the whole time. I also think vulnerability is a real proxy for strength. Some of the strongest and most amazing leaders I know are also incredibly vulnerable. They will show you they'll show you behind the veil anytime, and they aren't afraid of it. They've looked at that monster in the eye and they understand what it is. I think it also really helps you engage with others, especially if they happen to be vulnerable. I think you really, really get some advantages there, and which is why I'm really encouraging teams to be more vulnerable with each other. So I realize I'm up here trying to tell everyone to do this just super simple thing, just be emotionally vulnerable, it's totally fine, it won't be hard at all, but that's bullshit. Admitting where you are amazing and where you need to grow is one of the hardest things I've had to do. truly saying, hey, I think I'm good at this thing, other people have confirmed I'm good at this thing, you should feel that way. You shouldn't feel bad about putting your time into something and coming away feeling like, hey, I actually have invested time. I know some things. Doesn't mean you need to be rude and mansplain it to everyone, but you absolutely can get those experiences and feel good about them. But it's also really important to value where we don't measure up, where we have abilities to grow. And having a team that's able to evaluate each other and build on those weaknesses so they turn into strengths is where you get really amazing teams. Also, introspection can be kind of terrifying. I think everyone's heard of the staring into the void concept. This is what it looked like for me. I was really afraid to embrace, my inner thoughts and evaluate what those meant for me. So embracing fear, obviously dovetails really, really nicely into this. Again, have the Kachina Peak example. So this is my actual photo of Kachina Peak where I went and skied down it that day. I also skied down it with a gentleman who is 75 years old, and he beat me to the base of the mountain by like 30 minutes. I think he had time for a beer, and he made new friends. So. And he asked me if I had my skis on the wrong foot, and I asked why, and he's like, well, I saw you lose a couple skis, so I figured you were just swapping them from time to time. I was like, that's a really nice way to shame me, I appreciate that. But the way I like to think about this is emotional vulnerability is like that wall, it's heavy armor. Heavy armor is fantastic if you are on a horse and you're facing up against another knight, but if you actually need to go somewhere, if you need to travel long distances, heavy armor will not help you. Heavy armor will hold you back, it will restrict your movements, it will restrict what you're capable of. The other thing, my recommendation for how to embrace this fear is to take it iteratively. Start really small. Start with something, start with someone you really trust. Be more vulnerable than you've been with them before. See if you get a positive experience. If you do, iterate that. Find out, what felt good, what was hard, what other footholds can I get here, and iterate on that. Try it again. Learn from your mistakes and build from there. The other thing is, if you learn these mistakes, please share them with others. That's the whole point of my talk is I want to come up here and be vulnerable so that others hopefully engage in this process faster. Don't spend 20 years wanting to do the thing you want to do like I did. That's foolish. If you take anything away from the talk, let it be that. I want everyone to actually try and practice vulnerability. Like I said, I think one of the easiest ways to do this is start small. Start with someone you've already built some trust with. You don't have much wobble there, so it's okay to apply a little more authenticity in that scenario. I think you will find that you will get much better responses from people you care about, people you engage with at work, all of that. So this is all well and good. We've chatted about, what is all this emotional, feel-good stuff mean? What does it look like? Now, how does this actually dovetail back into SecOps? So a team of people who investigate security issues, tracks security performance, and educates the organization on security risks and practices. That's my roughish definition. We'll come up with Kat's here in a moment. Hers is much better. But basically, being open and vulnerable to your teammates not only accelerates team growth, but it also builds trust. I've wasted my time trying to appear that I knew everything. I was a consultant, and when you consult, saying I don't know is not a really good answer. It doesn't close a lot of deals for you. It doesn't gender a lot of faith in your ability as a consultant. So you end up saying yes, and then running as fast as you can to Google, and then learning that thing you said you knew how to do. That's bullshit. Don't waste your time doing that. Be honest with people and work with people that will work with you when you say, I don't know how to do that yet. Have them take your hand and take you there. Like, that's the whole point of a team. That's the whole point of this kind of exercise. Teams who are not afraid to be vulnerable will reach these conclusions faster. And they don't need to sit there and preserve each other's egos because you already have rapport with each other. You know that you're not going to be made fun of or pilloried or whatever because you have a particular thought or you think you don't measure up in some way. So here is Kat's fantastic quote about this. So I will go ahead and read it because she gave me this as feedback for my talk, and I was like, this needs to be in my talk. This isn't feedback. So operational teams are charged with maintaining organizational stability, and incident response is about recovering to a state of stability. We can do this best when we have a solid foundation of a good culture, fueled by empathy and vulnerability to build off of. So thank you, Kat. Great job. Oops, jumped ahead too far. So let's talk about this incident response a little bit. I love this XKCD comic because for several reasons I'll go into. So if you don't know what sudo is, it's not a big deal. It's a program that basically says, hey, you don't have enough permissions to do that. Would you like to have some more permissions? We'll make sure that you are that right person, then we'll go ahead and let you do it. Now, when you run a sudo su, you're basically turning into root, is what this command is doing. Now, in this case, you get a text message back saying, hey, this incident's going to be reported. Well, that's great. What does that mean? Who's absorbing that incident? Well, what that really means is going into a log somewhere, and unless somebody's looking at that log or has process and procedure to act on that log, more than likely absolutely nothing's happening. But I love that Santa is actually getting this list and keeping track of who's root and not. This is also funny because we happen to use Santa, so that's just another funny little wrinkle we've got here. But incident response is difficult work. It is essentially basically the job of trying to investigate something that happened, trying to dig into, hey, this looks like a bad thing. Let's get background information on it. Let's learn what this process that led up to it, and then let's evaluate, was this an incident? Was this not? Is this just a faulty alert, or do we have Fancy Bear running all over our network? More information up front is probably the most important thing that you can get in IR. I've never been in an IR where like, oh, I've got all the information I need. I don't need to dig into any logs. I don't need to do any follow-up questioning. And that's where this kind of leads. If you're a good incident responder, you will not have all the logs you need. If you do, let's chat about that afterward because I want to find out how you got them all. But I truly believe most incident responders are looking for information. They are looking for solutions. And the people who have those solutions are staff. They are your coworkers, they are your teammates. If you don't have any empathy, any vulnerability with them, what is their motivation to be honest with you? If they think that you intend to rat them out to the executives or go back to the security team and say, oh, this person, they're doing it all wrong, they're the reason we got hacked, you're not gonna be honest with them. You have no motivation to share any of the critical details that I need to solve the case. And I honestly believe that people will be invested in your IR program if they see value to it, if they understand, oh, Joe wants to do this because he wants to shut this down so it doesn't happen next time. He wants this to, he wants to understand what this incident is so we can put logging in place, so we will know about this, so we can maybe automate at some point and if we see this sort of stuff, if it's risky enough. It's also, the other thing I want to stress here is that vulnerability and empathy cost you nothing, but how many other talks have you gone to where you got everything was completely free? There's an open source tool, but you have to train on it. This is something that is intrinsic to all humans. We can all be vulnerable. We can all be empathetic to each other. This doesn't cost you budget or a bunch of time. It costs you some mental effort. And some people have asked me, how can you do empathy and vulnerability when it's incident response? Don't you need to be screaming at people and running around like your hair's caught on fire? And there's some of that. But people are, if I can't slow down and say thank you or say I really appreciate it, or after the incident's over, following up with them and say, hey, I know that was really stressful. I'm sorry to have to wake you up in the middle of the night, ask you questions, but I really appreciate your help. Here's the outcome. Here's what we resolved. Here's what we understood because of the information you shared with me. I think that's really, really critical if you want to engage people and you want them to participate the next time you come to ask them questions. So security awareness. This is a beautiful door in Morocco. I believe it's in Fez. And I'm going to use the metaphor here of, I don't know how secure this door is. I have no security education on it. It might be the world's most secure door. It might be completely impenetrable. It might be 6 inches thick and has 100,000 guards behind it and hot boiling oil, who knows. Or it could be decorative. I really don't have any way of gauging that. And I really kind of think that security awareness is the same thing. We can't expect people to operate these doors safely or operate locks safely if they have no experience with them. We need to make sure that we've educated them, that we've brought them an understanding of the tools that they use, and not just expect that they find it on their own. When you're presenting and doing security awareness training, if you aren't empathetic, if you aren't vulnerable, why are people going to listen to you? So one of the things that I like to do is I like to lead off how I have failed. I tell people the viruses I have installed. I tell them the phishing links that I have clicked on. I tell them the Exchange servers I have accidentally deleted. Because I believe that if you haven't made mistakes in security, you're going to make them and they're going to be really, really intense. If you don't have these scars to point out on your body and say, here's why I did this terrible thing, here's why I did this thing, you're going to get fresh scars, is basically how that goes. I also think that, security education is also really, really critical. Feedback is really, really critical in security education. So again, if people aren't willing to tell you, hey Joe, that was a great phishing example, but we didn't understand anything you said, and you talked really fast, and you seem really sure of yourself, but the impact wasn't there. If you're not taking that feedback and changing it, meeting with those people, and really, really improving your program, you're doing them a disservice. You are not setting those people up to succeed. I'll let this GIF run for a moment. So vulnerability management, or I'll put this with the other fire, as I like to call it. So if you're not familiar with vulnerability management, it is the practice of trying to hunt things and discover them before bad guys do, or before consequences come from these sorts of vulnerabilities. Oftentimes this means looking for unpatched servers, looking for protocols you use that are out of date, those sorts of things. Vulnerability management also usually means interfacing with operational teams or IT teams. And if you want to do that, you need to make sure that you understand their world. If you have an operational team that is busy and booked 24/7 and has a ticket queue that they are not going to be able to clear in the next 2 years, you throwing tons of CVEs over the wall and saying, patch all this, isn't going to get you anywhere. It's actually going to piss that team off, in my experience, and it's going to get you nowhere closer to having these vulnerabilities patched. If you take the time to sit down with your ops people, understand what their workload is, understand what their pain points are, understand what their tolerance is for patching, you're going to go much further with your vulnerability management. The other thing is you can't patch all the things sometimes. So remediation and compensating controls are really, really critical here. If you don't take the time to understand if those compensating controls are actually going to work, or if they're not even viable in your environment, you aren't going to have a good day. It's going to be really tough for you. And stakeholders are looking for you to guide them. They are not looking to be put down. They are not looking to be told how stupid they are, or how could you leave this thing unpatched, or how come you aren't consuming every CVE. I struggle to do those things. I mean, when somebody comes to me and says a CVE number that I don't know, I'm like, oh, did I just fail as an InfoSec analyst? And the answer is no. It's probably impossible. If you have an eidetic memory, maybe you can submit them all to memory. I don't know the value you would achieve from that, but it's really, really important to understand what those teams who are going to be consuming these vulnerability reports are. If you aren't giving them helpful information, if you aren't grading these things, if you aren't providing context, then what are you doing? You are basically just shoveling garbage to them and hoping that they can make sense of that garbage. You're actually making the system worse, as far as I can tell. So that leads us to some of the common challenges that we have in SecOps. This is another picture from Morocco. It's incredibly foggy and is supposed to be. This basically represents the fog of war that we operate under. We don't have enough information almost ever, and so we're always occupying this opaque space. We're always trying to discern, is this information helpful? Is this risk too much? Is this threat going to consume us? There is this concept of muscle memory. And if you don't take the time to train and do feedback loops, you will not be able to develop that muscle memory. If you're doing incident response and you're doing it from a procedure you've never done before, you're going to have a bad incident response. I actually did an incident response recently, and it was a tabletop. And even in a tabletop situation where we have perfect knowledge, we know everything about what's going to happen, there were details I missed. I asked questions that people didn't expect. I mean, there is never a situation in an IR where everything is going to be perfect, where you have everything you need. I think this all really boils down to data and communication. And I think the only really way we improve those is empathy and vulnerability, AKA trust. So I'm going to go into story mode for a little bit here to tell you all some hopefully interesting stories that will shed some light on these important issues. So we have a queue that we manage, one of many queues, and this particular queue wasn't getting the attention it deserved. It wasn't completely forgotten about, but it just wasn't getting enough time and attention. We weren't reducing the ticket count fast enough. And even worse than that, we as a team weren't chatting about it. We all kind of knew individually that it wasn't where it needed to be, that there was definitely room for growth there, but we weren't talking about it. And this was producing this silent failure mode where we as an operational team should have had plenty of warning. We had abilities to see this coming, but we didn't act on it. So our managers did exactly what we should. Let's get everybody in the same room. Let's chat about it. Let's figure out what's working, what's not. And when I was going into this meeting, I was having these flashbacks to previous employers, previous jobs, where I've had these meetings before, I've had an obligation or a duty that I was responsible for, I wasn't meeting that obligation or duty, and it's usually, let's get in a room and scream at each other and put a huge divide between us, and then suffer and suffer further and further until we have no working relationship. And unfortunately, I've done that several times in my career. And I'm up here to encourage you to not do that. What happened in this meeting was the exact opposite of what I expected. And part of it was probably because I brought some different feelings to that meeting. When I decided to go to this meeting, instead of being defensive, instead of having 1,000 great excuses why I wasn't over the finish line, I came and I was honest. I said, I'm ignorant of this process. I get how it should work in theory, but I have tons of questions, and I'm embarrassed about some of them. I feel like I should know this stuff. I feel like I should be able to be impactful here, and I just don't have the knowledge yet. And I was also so impressed with my other teammates because they brought their own issues, and we enumerated each and every one of them, and we solved them. We found ways to work around them. We found ways to encourage each other. We made sure that whoever's responsibility it was on the queue, that the others needed to check in with them, that they needed to make sure, hey, do you actually have enough bandwidth to do this? Are you able to do this? And that was all we needed to do. This wasn't this, we didn't need to move heaven and earth in order to make this happen. We just needed to communicate with each other better and trust each other better. And we needed to be kinder than necessary and say, hey, we're about to exceed that thing. How do we get together and prevent that? And as a team, we've never done it again. And I'm really, really proud of that moment. And I believe it's brought us closer together than any other thing we've done, if I'm totally honest. So I have another fun story I want to chat with y'all about. I love this Angela Lansbury GIF. There's a little popcorn theme going on here if you hadn't got it. But basically, this was another previous employer that I worked for. They had a company that worked in oil and gas. They had a particular customer who leased land to them. And I had their accountant reach out to me one day with this strange email. She said, hey, I got this email. Everything about it looks right, but the wiring information is different. And I don't suspect that this guy who's been receiving these payments to a bank in Texas for 10 years is really wanting them to go through the Caymans now. That doesn't feel right, doesn't seem right. And thank goodness for this accountant. I mean, I want to sit here and then give her a round of applause. She's the true InfoSec rock star here, if we want to put that label on anyone, because she's the actual person who spotted this. Without her observation, my analysis, okay, it's great, but it doesn't solve anything because the wire fraud would have already occurred. So she sends me this email. I go ahead and do some analysis on it, and it's one of the best spear phishing emails I've ever seen. They picked up in the middle of a thread. They had read through the email enough to have really, really good context. They had reused letterhead. I mean, it was perfect. Literally the only thing that was different was the wiring information. The template, the document, everything else was identical. So I looked into SPF and DKIM. It absolutely had been delivered by Office 365. So I'm now within the opinion, I'm like, okay, this is absolutely a compromised email account. All we need to do is just chat about a compromised email account, change the password, roll MFA, ta-da, everything's great. I was super proud of myself. I was like, this is gonna be a slam dunk. Go into the meeting, and the company I was directly working for was like, that's great work, good job, Joe. But this customer said, that's a great story, but I don't believe you. And I was really taken aback. I was like, I had done all this great technical work. I'm super smart, pat me on the back now. And they just weren't having it. And so I was at an impasse. I could have chosen to say, hey, my ego's more important here. I did great technical work, so I don't really care what you think about it. Or I could figure out how to engage with this person. I could figure out how to stop this attack. And at the end of the day, having someone steal 7 figures from someone was much more important than my ego. Because I have a pretty good feeling whoever is stealing that money wasn't going to do good things with it. So I kind of put my hat in hand and went to this customer and I said, hey, can we have a private meeting? No computers, we won't talk about technology at all. I just want to talk about your business and I want to talk about this risk that I see for your business. So I sat down and I learned about his business. I learned that it was a paper and pen business for 30, 40 years before he ever had a computer involved. So he didn't really look at computers as this great problem solver for him. It actually was a problem. He didn't want to use it, but everyone he interacted with required him to send emails and transact over it, so he begrudgingly used it. And to add another wrinkle, his son had helped him configure his networks, and he had a lot of faith and reasons to believe in his son. And I didn't want to question that or come in and be rude and drive a further wedge between the two of us. So I just sat down and explained to him, I truly believe someone's trying to steal money from you. I understand that you think your son has done a really good job, and for the most part he has. He's put you on a great platform, things are great, but there's a few things we need to tweak here. If we set you up with a different password and roll MFA, that's all I want to do. That's all I want to do. Just sit for 6 months. We'll see if they have any other pings or anything else happens. We did that, and absolutely nothing came in 6 months. I'm not saying that I gave him the world's best password, I gave him an unhackable account, but I took something that was a real risk that was absolutely going to threaten this company, and instead of being satisfied with getting the technical answer right, I was satisfied when I actually got the solution, and when I engaged and was empathetic and vulnerable with that person. That person really needed someone to look at and be an advocate for them, and it required me to put my ego aside, but it was a really amazing lesson that is the value here. Taking your ego, putting it aside, reaching out, helping that customer, helping that bottom line, that is why we are here. We are not here to pat ourselves on the back. We are not on here to have the most internet points. We are here to do best for our customers. So I could not have a talk without some sort of Hamilton reference because my manager would be very, very heartbroken. But I do have a couple of closing thoughts that I want to leave you all with. The first is, can your SecOps team afford to be ineffective in the face of sometimes the daunting task of maintaining security for a company? Being empathetic and vulnerable is not the default position for many people, and I understand that. It takes work and it takes effort. However, the personal and team growth that can come from it is truly transformational. Managers and executives who want effective teams who can produce in the long term should really, really consider trying to hire for these traits and encourage these traits inside of their teams. Individuals who want to have stronger relationships with their managers and their other teammates should engage in this as well. One of the biggest values you will get as an individual contributor is to be able to put your ego aside and watch others grow. It is a truly amazing feeling, and I encourage you all to do it. And that's all I have for today. I'd love to take any questions if anyone's interested.